And so as I was saying, Heidegger used to like to track down the etymology of words in order to find hidden, occluded, or forgotten beings, and he called this process, in fact, destruction. Same thing Derrida is calling this process deconstruction. But traces are not exactly concepts, but they are polysemic, and every sign contains reflections and traces of its sense of self-identity by differentiating itself from other signs, but it also contains traces of those other signs within it, almost like a sort of cloud, a ghostly cloud of meanings that cut across simple oppositions that the logocentric tradition insists on, like nature and culture. As we had seen in the essay on Plato's pharmacy, the word pharmakon has multiple significations that play across a field of differences that resist. The trace basically is the remainder of that which is left over, that is irreducible to conceptual opposition, because it's a cloud of differences that are much more polysemic and slippery than the logocentric tradition is comfortable with. But it also makes meaning possible in the first place. Archi-writing also is the spacing principle. It's spatio-temporal, but it's also the spatial principle between signifiers and between. Language basically is granular. It has this granular structure, and that granular structure is precisely the archi-writing, the difference that gives to language its ability to play significations through the generation of pairs of opposites, through differences in the language. And he says that part of the problem then in the metaphysical tradition is that the trace is reduced. The trace, all these multiple significations, are reduced through subordinating the trace to the full presence of the logos. In doing that, simple oppositions come about that are maintained as though they were engraved in stone, as it were, as though they were absolute, but they are not, and the remainder gets left over as the trace. But this trace, if we dig it up, bring it to light, since it's not normally visible, since traces erase themselves, they bear within themselves the principle of self-erasure, so that you have to dig them up. You have to know how to dig them up. But in digging them up, the way Derrida did for Pharmakon and Plato's pharmacy, if you dig them up, then you can destabilize the logocentric insistence on pairs of opposites and nailing meanings down by reducing traces so that the play of signification doesn't take place. The logocentric tradition wants to resist play, and Derrida is trying to bring the play of signification back in, and he can do this in the absence of a transcendental signified. Now, since the transcendental signified is gone, there's nothing any longer controlling and reducing the trace, the play of difference, to a simple set of linear oppositions. All kinds of semiotic pyrotechnics can now take place. If you type in, one example, a simple mundane example, is if you type in the word difference on your computer will, being a logocentric system, will automatically correct the spelling of difference, difference. It'll correct it if you type in différence to difference. It'll put the E in automatically unless you go back and tell it that you wanted it the other way. That's an example of the kind of logocentrism that eliminates the play of the trace. It goes without saying then that James Joyce could never have written Finnegan's Wake on a laptop. The laptop wouldn't have let him do that kind of play of signification that Finnegan's Wake represents. Finnegan's Wake is a very, it uses a lot of this play, a lot of this différence. And so he ends this chapter by talking about the hinge, la brisure, and the hinge is simply what weds together the grapheme with the phoneme in space and time. The grapheme is the written signifier, and the phoneme is the spoken signifier, and they're wed together through the process of differentiation in space and time, and the hinge is what links them together. But it's also the idea that both speech and writing, getting back to where he started about deconstructing the apparent absoluteness of the opposition between speech and writing, both speech and writing are manifestations of an exterior, of a movement of meaning from an interior to an exterior. So this is what archi-writing is. Whether it is the case that the writing, as it were, is inscribed on a surface, as in the case of literal writing, or whether it is simply exteriorized in the medium of the voice, doesn't matter. Both are forms of the exteriorization of meaning, and both are therefore forms of writing. And so we have the idea that what he had set out to accomplish was to demonstrate that speech and writing have a common ancestor through this archi-writing, that is the play of difference, and the trace that's originary, but also erases itself as it produces these pairs of opposites. It erases all these original other differential forms of meaning, all these other polysemic meanings that get erased in the process, but do leave traces through things like, that are evident in things like etymology and the study of words. Heidegger changing the spelling of being, for example, B-E-I-N-G to B-E-Y-N-G-E, which is an older meaning of being, finding that trace in that word and bringing it to light. And so, as I say, the trace is almost very much like a kind of collective unconscious of language, as though it had its own ancient, archaic strata with all these traces in there that can be brought up, but that are repressed by the logocentric tradition that has to maintain its authoritative presence, its metaphysics of presence, by demonstrating to you these these pairs of opposites that are absolutely rigid, and it does that by repressing the play of signification. But the traces are still there. They hang around to someone who knows how to find them, like Derrida or Joyce or Heidegger. These are classic men who know how to manipulate the play of signification. So Saussure's opposition, his absolute opposition between the interior of linguistics and writing on the exterior, then is no longer an opposition. If we can think of both speech and writing as exteriorizations of an originary interior, an archi-writing that made them possible in the first place, then that opposition collapses, and we have the play of signification across a field of differences, and we no longer have a transcendental signified controlling the operation and limiting the meanings that we can run off with and play with. There's a lot to do here. Then this begins the process of liberating writing from the logocentric tradition. The trace is something that made writing possible and cannot itself, therefore, that made the episteme possible, that made science possible, and cannot therefore become an object of knowledge. In the traditional idea of the science of writing, the logocentric science of writing, archi-writing, or the trace, would be an object of knowledge, but it is precisely that which makes knowledge possible in a transcendental sense in the first place, and so it cannot be an object of knowledge in the logocentric tradition. So it found something else, grammatology, which is basically another word at this point early in Derrida's career for deconstruction. Deconstruction is grammatology. It is opposed to the metaphysics of presence and to the logocentric tradition, but not completely opposed to them, since he's trying to get us outside of the habit of thinking in terms of pure metaphysical oppositions. These are oppositions that can be overridden by a play of difference that enables us to see how these pairs of opposites are generated in the first place and are given and presented as though they were authoritative. And so that's basically the upshot of the second chapter of this marvelous book, Derrida's Grammatology. I didn't garble.